The first time Daniel noticed the dog following him, he didn't think much of it. It was a scruffy golden retriever mix with patches of dirt on his fur and kind, intelligent eyes. Daniel had spotted him sitting outside the coffee shop he visited every morning. At first, the dog simply watched him from a distance, head slightly tilted, tail wagging just enough to show curiosity. But then, as Daniel walked home, he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned back, and there the dog was, keeping a careful distance but following nonetheless. Daniel chuckled. "What, you got nowhere else to be, buddy?" The dog just stared at him, tail wagging a little faster. Daniel shook his head, amused, and continued walking. The dog followed him all the way to his apartment building, then sat at the corner as Daniel disappeared inside. When he peeked out his window a few minutes later, the dog was gone. It became a pattern. Every morning, the dog waited near the coffee shop, and every evening he followed Daniel home, never getting too close, never asking for food or attention, just watching. Daniel found himself growing attached. He even started carrying an extra sandwich in his bag, leaving it out for the dog when he got home. The dog would sniff at it, eat quietly, and then disappear again into the night. Days turned into weeks, and still, the dog never missed a morning or evening. Until one day, Daniel decided to find out why. This time, instead of walking straight home, he stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and turned fully to face the dog. "All right, buddy, what's your deal? Why do you follow me every day?" The dog stopped too, sitting down as if he understood the question. Daniel hesitated, then took a slow step toward him. To his surprise, the dog didn't run. Instead, he whined, a soft, heartbreaking sound, then turned and began trotting away. For the first time, the dog wasn't following Daniel. He was leading him, and something in Daniel's heart told him to follow. So he did. And what he found that night would change everything. Daniel's heart pounded as he followed the dog through the dimly lit streets. The city was quiet at this hour, the usual noise of traffic replaced by the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hum of streetlights. The dog trotted ahead with purpose, glancing back every few steps as if making sure Daniel was keeping up. "All right, buddy," Daniel muttered, his breath fogging in the cool air. "Where are we going?" The dog led him down a few blocks, past familiar storefronts and quiet apartment buildings. Then, Daniel realized they were heading toward the outskirts of town, the part he rarely visited. The streets became less polished, the buildings older, the streetlights farther apart. Still, he followed. Finally, the dog turned down a narrow alleyway and stopped in front of an abandoned house. It was small and run down, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. Weeds grew wildly around the edges, and an old fence leaned dangerously to one side. Daniel hesitated. "You live here?" The dog whimpered softly, then looked toward the house. Something inside Daniel told him this was more than just an old stray looking for shelter. Slowly, he stepped forward, peering through a broken window. The interior was dark, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw something that made his chest tighten. A small pile of blankets, empty food cans, a plastic water bottle half full, and then movement. A shadow stirred in the corner. Daniel's breath caught. It wasn't an animal, it was a person. A frail-looking figure, curled up against the wall, wrapped in an old coat that was far too thin for the cold night air. Daniel's stomach twisted. This isn't just a stray dog, this was a dog protecting someone. A low whine broke the silence, and Daniel looked down to see the dog watching him with pleading eyes. Not for food, not for shelter, for help. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "Hey," he called softly, stepping closer to the window. "Are you okay?" The figure stirred again. A faint, shaky voice answered. "Please don't call the police." Daniel felt something deep in his chest crack wide open. This dog hadn't just been following him, he had been choosing him. And now, Daniel finally understood why. Daniel's chest tightened as he processed the frail voice from inside the abandoned house. He could barely make out the person's shape in the darkness. But he knew one thing for certain. Whoever they were scared. The dog nudged his leg gently, as if urging him forward. Daniel swallowed hard and crouched near the window. "Hey, I'm not here to hurt you," he said gently. I want to help." Silence. Then, slowly, the figure shifted. A weak cough broke the stillness, and the dim glow of a streetlight revealed a young girl, maybe 15 or 16, wrapped in layers of torn clothing. Her face was pale, her hands trembling from the cold. Daniel's heart clenched. She looked exhausted, starving, alone. The dog whined and padded closer to her, nuzzling her gently before curling up beside her like a guardian. She reached out with shaking fingers, stroking his fur. He always comes back," she murmured. "Every night he brings me something, a sandwich, a piece of bread, even just company when it's cold." She swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I think he knew I needed more than that." Daniel blinked hard, his throat tightening. The dog hadn't been following him all this time. He had been testing him, watching him, making sure he was someone who would help. Daniel exhaled, his hands balling into fists. How had no one noticed this girl? How had she ended up here relying on the loyalty of a stray dog to survive? Carefully, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the extra sandwich he always brought for the dog. "Here," he said, setting it down gently inside the window. "It's fresh. You should eat." The girl hesitated, but the dog nudged the sandwich closer to her with his nose. Slowly, she picked it up and took a small, hesitant bite. Daniel watched as she chewed carefully, as if she wasn't used to eating regularly. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, eyes flickering with uncertainty. Then softly, she whispered, "Maya." Daniel nodded, his voice firm but kind. "Okay, Maya, I don't know how you got here, but I'm not leaving you like this." The dog wagged his tail, as if he had known all along that Daniel would say that. Because tonight wasn't just another night of following. Tonight he had found the right person. And for the first time, Maya wasn't alone anymore. Maya stared at Daniel, her fingers still clutching the sandwich like she was afraid it might disappear. Her eyes held a mix of hesitation and something even deeper, hope. The dog nestled closer to her, his tail wagging softly as if he could sense that something was finally changing. Daniel took a slow breath. "Maya, how long have you been here?" She lowered her gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "A few months." Daniel's heart clenched. Months? In this freezing weather? He couldn't imagine the kind of strength it had taken to survive out here alone. "Where's your family?" he asked gently. Maya swallowed hard, shaking her head. "Nowhere." Daniel felt a familiar ache in his chest. He didn't know her full story yet, but he knew what loneliness felt like. He glanced at the dog, her only protector, her only friend. It was clear he had been looking after her, bringing her food, keeping her warm at night. But he had done something else too. He had found help. Daniel wasn't the kind of guy to turn a blind eye. He knew he couldn't just walk away, not after what he had seen. "I have a place nearby," he said carefully. "It's small, but it's warm. I won't push you, but if you need a meal, a shower, maybe just a safe place for a little while." He hesitated. "You don't have to keep fighting alone." Maya stiffened, her fingers tightening around the remains of her sandwich. The dog let out a soft woof and licked her hand, as if encouraging her. For a long moment she just sat there, staring at the ground. Then finally she whispered, "I don't want to be a burden." Daniel let out a shaky laugh, shaking his head. "You're not a burden, you're a fighter." Maya looked up at him then, searching his face as if trying to decide if she could trust him. And then the smallest nod. Daniel exhaled, relief flooding through him. "All right," he said, standing up. "Let's get you and your guardian angel out of the cold." The dog barked happily, wagging his tail as if he had just completed his mission. And for the first time in a long time, Maya let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. Daniel led Maya carefully out of the abandoned house, making sure she was steady on her feet. The dog trotted beside her, his tail wagging, but his eyes never leaving her, as if still guarding her with every step. The walk back to Daniel's apartment was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Maya clutched her coat tightly around herself, her breath visible in the cold night air. Daniel noticed how she stayed close to the dog, her fingers brushing against his fur every now and then, as if drawing strength from him. When they reached the apartment building, Daniel hesitated. He didn't want to overwhelm her. "If at any point you feel uncomfortable, you say the word, all right?" Maya gave him a small nod, but there was still uncertainty in her eyes. Inside, the warmth of the apartment wrapped around them like a blanket. Maya shivered slightly, adjusting to the sudden change in temperature. The dog sniffed the air, his tail flicking as he explored. Daniel moved to the kitchen. "I don't have anything fancy, but I can heat up some soup. Sound good?" Maya hesitated, then nodded again. As he warmed the food, he snuck a few glances at her. Now that she was standing in proper lighting, he could see just how thin she was, how exhaustion clung to her shoulders like a weight she had been carrying for too long. When he handed her a steaming bowl of soup, she murmured a quiet, "Thank you." Daniel sat across from her, giving her space to eat. The dog curled up at her feet, finally looking at peace. After a few moments, Maya set down her spoon and looked at Daniel. "Why are you helping me?" Her voice was soft, but there was something raw beneath it, like she wasn't used to kindness without conditions. Daniel met her gaze, his expression steady. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it most." Maya blinked, surprised. Daniel exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "I didn't have an easy time growing up. No family to rely on, no real home for a while. I got lucky. Someone gave me a chance when I had nothing." He gave her a small, gentle smile. "Now I get to do the same for someone else." Maya stared at him, processing his words. For the first time that night, her shoulders seemed to relax just a little. The dog, as if sensing the moment, let out a happy sigh and rested his head on Maya's lap. Daniel smiled. "Looks like he trusts me." Maya ran her fingers through the dog's fur, a flicker of something close to a smile crossing her lips. "Yeah," she whispered, "me too." And just like that, a new beginning had quietly started. Over the next few days, Maya slowly began to adjust. At first, she barely spoke, always keeping the dog close as if afraid everything might disappear at any moment. But little by little, she started to settle in. She took long showers, letting the warmth soak into her skin. She ate full meals, sometimes hesitantly, as if still not used to having food she didn't have to ration. And at night she slept, really slept, for the first time in what seemed like forever. The exhaustion that had once dulled her eyes began to fade, and through it all, the dog never left her side. Daniel didn't push her to talk, didn't ask for details she wasn't ready to give. He simply let her be. He went about his normal life, leaving extra blankets out for her, making sure there was always food, giving her the space to breathe. One evening, as they sat in the small living room, Daniel on the couch, Maya on the floor beside the dog, she finally spoke up. "I used to have a home," she murmured, stroking the dog's fur. "But it wasn't safe." Daniel didn't say anything, he just listened. Maya swallowed. "I ran away, thought I'd be better off on my own, but I wasn't." She gave a weak laugh. "Turns out the world isn't kind to people like me." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had guessed as much, but hearing it made his chest ache. "But then he found me," she continued, nudging the dog's ear. It was like he just knew I needed someone. Daniel smiled. He's got a good heart. Maya nodded. Yeah, he does. She looked up at Daniel then, her expression soft. So do you. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. She was healing. Slowly, but surely. A few days later, Daniel took her to a community center where he knew they could help her find resources. Shelter, education, support. Maya hesitated at first, but with the dog trotting beside her, she took the first steps toward rebuilding her life. And when the time came for her to move into a safe housing program, Daniel made sure of one thing. She wouldn't go alone, because the dog that had once followed him through the streets had already made his choice. He had found his person, and no matter where life took them next, they would never be alone again. Kindness, loyalty, and love can change lives in ways we never expect. This story proves that even the smallest act of compassion can make a world of difference. Now, here's a question for you. If an animal led you somewhere, would you follow? Tell us in the comments. And if you believe in the power of second chances, hit subscribe, because the world needs more people who choose to care.